The fluorescent lights hummed above Trauma Bay 3, a sound like a refrigerator holding its breath, and Katie Morrison arranged surgical instruments with the precision of someone who had done this 10,000 times before. 14-gauge angiocath needles in ascending order. Hemostats lined like soldiers at attention. The smell of antiseptic hung thick enough to taste, sharp and clinical and sterile. She was restocking the crash cart when Dr. Mercer arrived for morning rounds, his white coat pristine as fresh snow, his eyes already scanning the trauma unit for weakness. She didn't look up. That was Rule 1. "Let's review the triage decisions from yesterday," Mercer announced to the cluster of residents trailing behind him like ducklings, his voice pitched loud enough to fill the corridor. His hand reached out and plucked a chart from the rack, Katie's chart, with her neat handwriting documenting vitals and interventions in the margins. "Our nursing staff made some interesting choices. Some would say questionable choices." Katie's hands continued moving. Tape. Gauze. 4x4 sterile pads arranged in careful stacks. She had learned early that invisibility was a form of armor. When Mercer pointed out an admission decision as a cautionary tale to the medical students, when he raised his eyebrows at her notation about fluid replacement timing, when he turned to the residents and said with theatrical concern, "Can anyone identify the critical error our nursing staff made here?" Katie simply pulled on fresh gloves and moved to the next bay. The residents shifted uncomfortably. One of them, a third year with kind eyes, glanced at her with something that might have been apology. She gave no sign of noticing. But that wasn't the worst part. The vending machine in the break room buzzed its familiar electronic hum as Katie inserted bills, 2 crumpled ones and some change that clanked into the mechanism. Black coffee, no sugar. That was what she wanted, something bitter and uncomplicated. The machine dispensed her cup with mechanical indifference, and she was turning to leave when Mercer's voice drifted in from the hallway, carried on a wave of laughter from the 2 interns trailing him. "I mean, seriously, can anyone with just an associate's degree even comprehend basic pharmacology?" His tone was conversational, almost friendly, the way you might discuss a genuinely puzzling question over dinner. "The metabolic pathways alone require what? A year of organic chemistry. Maybe 2. The interns laughed. One of them, a woman with highlighted hair and a stethoscope draped like jewelry around her neck, said something Katie didn't catch. Mercer's response came swift, "Exactly my point. It's frankly irresponsible to rely on someone with that background for anything beyond basic observation." Katie stood motionless beside the humming vending machine. Her jaw didn't clench. Her face didn't burn. Her coffee steamed in her hand, and she took a slow sip, tasting the bitterness without reaction. The thing they didn't know, the thing that made her hand steady when everyone else's trembled, was that she had spent 18 months at the Naval Hospital in San Diego studying advanced pharmacology as part of her operator training. She had learned drug half-lives not from textbooks but from watching medics in the field make calculations under fire. She knew epinephrine dosing not from a lecture hall but from pushing it into a teammate's chest while Taliban bullets punched through the wooden clinic walls around them. But she was just restocking supplies now. Just a nurse with an associate's degree. She walked past them, her shoulders relaxed, her breathing level. Mercer didn't even glance at her. Why would he? She was part of the furniture. The photograph was tucked behind the folded flag in her locker, both kept in the small space she claimed in the nurse's break room. 6 inches by 4 inches, faded by time and the desert sun, her son, James Morrison, and Captain Derek Morrison standing together in Kandahar, both men dark with dust, both smiling at something beyond the frame. James wore the rank of Lance Corporal. Captain Morrison wore his captain's bars like a man who had earned them in blood. The photograph had come home in the same manila envelope as the flag, along with a handwritten note on Pentagon letterhead that she had read so many times the creases threatened to tear through the paper entirely. That was what the official letter said. But the handwritten note on the back, in Captain Derek Morrison's own careful script, said, ** Your son was the bravest man I ever served with. He saved my life. I'll never forget him. **. Katie saw that same Captain Morrison's name in the admissions log that morning. Derek Morrison. Age 42. Admitted through the ER with chest pain and elevated cardiac markers. Scheduled for observation. The irony was sharp enough to cut. She pulled the chart. His vitals were stable, his EKG was unremarkable, but something in his history troubled her. No prior cardiac events. No family history. The troponin elevation was mild, and his symptom timeline didn't fit the textbook presentation of acute MI. She stood in the corridor holding his file, reading his words in her mind, *Your son was the bravest man I ever served with*, and something in her chest tightened that had nothing to do with cardiac disease. That was when Mercer's hand closed around her elbow. "Excuse me. This is a restricted procedure." His voice was steel-wrapped in civility. They were standing outside the cardiac catheterization lab, where Dr. Mercer was about to oversee a stress test on another patient. Katie held a valid state license. She had completed 200 hours of catheterization lab observation. She was legally, unambiguously permitted to be in that space. "I'll need you to wait outside." She could have argued. Could have cited the protocol. Could have pointed out that she had certification they didn't teach doctors in medical school, field trauma management, tactical medicine, emergency procedures performed in conditions that would make a civilian surgeon weep. Instead, she took one measured breath. Let a single tear escape, the kind that comes from fury not sadness, and wiped it without breaking eye contact. "I've seen steadier hands on 18-year-olds under mortar fire," she said quietly, her voice like still water, like something ancient and cold. The words were barely audible, Mercer had to lean in to hear them. When he did, something flickered across his face. Not understanding. Confusion, maybe. The confusion of a man who had just heard an accent he didn't expect from someone he had categorized as invisible. She walked away before he could respond, her spine straight, her composure intact. That was how you fought someone like Mercer. Not with anger. Not with tears or trembling hands or confrontation in front of witnesses. You fought with silence. With the terrible weight of a calm so complete that it suggested depths he could never fathom. The break room was empty when she retrieved the photograph again, opening her locker just enough to see it. Her son's smile. Captain Morrison's hand on James's shoulder. The handwritten note tucked beneath the folded flag like a prayer. She closed the locker carefully, let her forehead rest against the cool metal for exactly 3 seconds, then returned to work. The trauma unit waited for no one's emotional inventory. There were fours to hang, medications to verify, charts to maintain with the obsessive precision that kept people alive. Katie moved through her shift like a ghost, present but separate, her hand steady, her voice calm when she reported to other nurses, her attention absolute when patients needed her. She never spoke about Mercer again that day. Never mentioned the vending machine, the insults, the hand on her elbow. But the folded flag remained in her locker, pressed against her chest like a secret, waiting for the moment when her true name would finally matter. The crash cart stood 3 feet from Morrison's bed, its drawers organized with the precision of someone who'd performed this ritual 5,000 times. Katie was checking the captain's oxygen saturation, steady at 98%, good, when she heard the commotion outside. A thud. A shout cut short. The sound of a struggle moving fast down the corridor, boots and bodies colliding with the walls. She turned toward the door just as it exploded inward. The psych patient from county lockup burst through like a feral animal, all teeth and wild eyes and something sharp catching the fluorescent light above. The screwdriver in his right hand was sharpened to a needle point, the handle wrapped in gauze, a weapon born from hours of patience in a holding cell. His hands weren't restrained anymore. Somewhere between the evaluation unit and this room, someone had made a mistake. The security guard who should have been with him lay crumpled in the hallway, bleeding from a gash above his eye. The attacker's eyes locked on Captain Morrison, who was still lying in the hospital bed, cardiac leads attached to his chest, vulnerable and sedated. The patient charged. For strides. Maybe 5. Katie didn't think. The part of her brain that had lived through Bagram for 3 years took over, the part that moved faster than thought could travel, that turned threat assessment into muscle memory. She stepped between Morrison and the descending screwdriver without hesitation, her left shoulder opening to the strike like a door, and caught the man's wrist mid-arc. The blade went in clean. She felt it puncture the rotator cuff, slide between bone and cartilage, the pain arriving white-hot and immediate but secondary to the problem at hand. Real blood soaked through her scrubs in seconds, spreading dark and warm across the blue cotton. The attacker's momentum carried him forward, snarling, but Katie held his wrist with both hands now, her core locked, her body becoming a wall. She redirected his weight into the bedside table instead of Morrison's chest. The man crashed against it, the impact knocking the wind from his lungs. Security arrived before he could recover, 2 officers moving with brutal efficiency, one tackling him low while the other wrenched the screwdriver from his grip. Katie released him and stepped back, her left arm already useless, pressure point screaming. She pressed her right hand against the wound, felt the blood warm between her fingers, soaking through her palms. The fabric of her scrubs clung to her chest, wet and heavy. The monitors above Morrison's head were still beeping steady. Still stable. The immediate crisis had passed, the patient was alive, the attacker was restrained, security was calling for additional backup. That was when Captain Morrison's heart started to fail. The stress of the violence did it. The fear and adrenaline and the sudden eruption of chaos in what should have been a safe place. His vital signs spiraled. The heart rate climbed from 82 to 110 to 137, each beat faster than the last, irregular, the rhythm on the monitor beginning to fragment. Katie watched his eyes go wide with panic as his own body betrayed him. No. She moved toward him, still applying pressure to her own shoulder. No, Morrison, stay with me. His breathing was rapid, shallow. The oxygen saturation began to drop. 95. 92. 88. Crash cart! Katie shouted, her voice dropping an octave, something ancient and military rising through her civilian mask. I need crash cart now. A nurse from the adjacent room responded, already running. A resident appeared in the doorway, his face still white from whatever he'd witnessed in the hallway. The monitors shrieked, Morrison's heart rhythm dissolving completely, the organized electrical chaos of ventricular tachycardia collapsing into the flat line of cardiac arrest. Dr. Mercer appeared in the doorway behind the resident, pale as a corpse, his eyes moving from the sedated attacker to the blood on Katie's scrubs to Morrison's dying heart rhythm on the monitor. His mouth opened. Closed. No orders came out. Katie was already moving. Her right hand still pressed against the wound in her shoulder, blood pooling in the collar of her scrubs, she positioned herself at the head of the bed. The crash cart arrived, a nurse she didn't know pushing it, another resident trailing behind with a defibrillator. Katie looked at the resident, saw the hesitation in his posture, the way his eyes kept darting to Mercer for approval. Charge to 200, Katie said. Not a request. A command. Get me a central line kit. 14-gauge angiocath, set it up for the femoral access. The resident moved. So did the unfamiliar nurse. Mercer was still frozen in the doorway, his mouth working soundlessly, watching a trauma unit suddenly reorganized around a woman bleeding from the shoulder with more authority in her voice than any attending physician in the room. Clear! Katie called out, and Morrison's body convulsed as the defibrillator discharged. She watched the monitor, waited the prescribed seconds, saw the rhythm reassert itself, not normal yet, but organized, viable. Again. 250. Mercer finally found his voice. Morrison needs an attending physician. Katie's eyes didn't leave the monitor. Morrison needs compressions and drugs. I can do compressions with my right arm. Someone get me 1 milligram epinephrine, for push. The second defibrillation worked. Morrison's rhythm reformed into something that resembled normal sinus rhythm, though his blood pressure was bottoming out at 60 systolic. Katie's left shoulder was screaming, real nerve damage, real bleeding, but her hands moved on their own, practiced and certain, guiding the resident through the central line placement, calling out the medications, the drips, the pace. She could see Morrison's pupils, still reactive. Salvageable. The next words out of Mercer's mouth weren't medical orders. They were a phone call, dialed from his pocket device, spoken in a low voice to someone on the other end of the line. "Yes, hello, this is Dr. Mercer at Seattle General. I need to report a serious breach of protocol." "Yes, I'll hold." Katie didn't look at him. She was too busy keeping Morrison alive. Security had the psych patient subdued now, his hands properly restrained, his body surrounded by 4 officers and a transport team ready to move him to a secure facility. He'd caught someone's face with that screwdriver on his way in, a junior resident, 3 stitches above the left eye, dazed but functional. The hallway outside Morrison's room was beginning to fill with staff responding to the code blue, the controlled chaos of a trauma center operating at full readiness. Katie barked orders for another round of epinephrine, her voice steady as a surgical laser despite the blood loss, despite the pain that was information now, data telling her about tissue damage and arterial proximity and how much longer she could function at this level. Push fluids. Keep that systolic above 70. I need a portable chest X-ray and a 12-lead EKG as soon as this stabilizes. One of the nurses, the unfamiliar one who'd helped with the crash cart, was staring at Katie's shoulder. "You're bleeding bad," she said. "I'm aware." Katie didn't look at her own wound. Her eyes were on Morrison's chest, on the steady rise and fall of mechanical respiration now that the resident had successfully placed an endotracheal tube. "Once his vitals lock at stable, we're moving him to ICU. He stays monitored continuously for the next 72 hours. Cardiology consult, neuro consult, and a full psych evaluation." She was still giving orders when Dr. Mercer hung up his phone and took a measured step backward, positioning himself near the doorway where he had a clear view of the entire room. Katie could feel his gaze on her back, could sense the calculation happening in whatever part of him understood that something had fundamentally shifted in this room. She didn't acknowledge it. She was too busy keeping a Navy captain alive, blood running down her left arm in rivers, her voice steady as stone, her hand steady as surgical steel, as if she'd been doing this exact thing in exact conditions for years. Because she had. The defibrillator pads were cold against her trembling fingers, no, not trembling. Steady. Her right hand moved with mechanical precision while her left hung useless at her side, blood soaking through the gore someone had pressed there 60 seconds ago. The bleeding didn't matter. Morrison mattered. The monitor mattered. The flat line mattered. "Clear the bed," Katie said, her voice stripped of apology, stripped of the deference that had defined her for 7 years at Seattle General. This was command voice now. This was the voice that had called in air support at Bagram, that had ordered 17 Marines into a compound that should have been a tomb. Her hands positioned the adhesive electrode pads on Captain Morrison's bare chest, one below the right clavicle, one at the 5th intercostal space, mid-axillary line. Muscle memory took over. Her hands knew this rhythm the way a pianist knows Beethoven. Charging to 200 joules, she announced, though no one had asked her to announce anything. The defibrillator whined, building current. The room had gone dead silent except for the monitor's accusatory flatline and the rasp of her own breathing. Dr. Mercer stood 3 feet away, his mouth open like a hinge that had come unbolted. "Everyone clear," Katie said. Not a request. A command. Resident stepped back. A nurse released the ambu bag. Morrison's body lay exposed, vulnerable, his chest rising and falling with only the ventilator's mechanical push-pull, his heart a silent stone in his ribs. Katie's thumb found the shock button. Pressed. The electricity arced through Morrison's body like God's own hand reaching down to shake the life back into him. His chest convulsed upward, muscles contracting under the current. The monitor traced a wild spike, then fell silent again. Still flat line. No response, someone whispered. Katie was already climbing onto the stretcher beside him, positioning herself on his right side. Her left arm hung like a sandbag, useless and bleeding, but her right arm was pure function now. She interlaced her fingers, right hand over left wrist, even though the left wrist screamed in protest, and positioned herself over Morrison's sternum at the right height. The compressions had to be 2 inches deep. Exactly 2 inches. Any shallower and the coronary arteries wouldn't perfuse. Any deeper and she'd fracture ribs that were already fragile from months in a hospital bed recovering from a previous surgery. She began compressions at exactly 110 beats per minute, counting aloud. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Her right shoulder drove the rhythm, her core locked, her bodyweight doing the work instead of just her arm. Blood dripped from her left shoulder onto Morrison's hospital gown in a slow, regular rhythm that matched her compressions. Drip. Compression. Drip. Compression. A metronome of her own sacrifice. "Someone take over," a resident said, young, male, the kind of voice that belonged to someone who'd never held a life in their hands while their own life pulled out of them. "She's injured. She needs—" "No," Katie cut him off without breaking rhythm. 20 compressions. "Call it now." The monitor traced its cruel flat line. Her hands kept moving. The pain in her shoulder was a distant weather system now, something happening in another room. Pain was information. Pain meant she was still conscious. Pain meant Morrison was getting blood flow to his brain, to his heart, to the organs that would decide if he woke up or didn't. 30 compressions. Perfect depth. Perfect rhythm. "Charge to 360, she ordered, and someone, a nurse with sense, actually obeyed her instead of waiting for Mercer's permission. The defibrillator climbed its electrical octave. Katie delivered the second shock without hesitation, without doubt, without anything except the cold calculation of a woman who had performed field thoracotomies with a combat knife in the dust outside Bagram and knew exactly what it took to bring someone back from the edge. Morrison's body jumped again. The monitor went quiet. Then, a single beat. A blip that shouldn't exist. A heartbeat. "We have sinus rhythm," someone breathed. Katie kept her hands moving, lighter now, monitoring. The rhythm stabilized. 1 beat became 2, became 5, became a steady, blessedly normal pattern across the monitor. Blood pressure climbed, 70 over 40. 85 over 50. 102 over 68. The numbers rose like a prayer being answered. "Keep the 4 running," Katie said. "I want 2 units of O-negative ready, and get me an EKG once he's stabilized. Troponin levels. Full metabolic panel." Medical terminology poured out of her like orders from someone who'd trained for this, lived for this, been broken by this exact scenario 17 times before in hospitals that no longer existed, in languages she no longer spoke, in a life that had been officially erased. She stayed bent over Morrison's chest for another 3 minutes, her hands performing compressions at reduced pressure, monitoring his response, watching his oxygen saturation climb on the monitor. 88, 91, 94, 97. Beautiful numbers. Survival numbers. Only when his blood pressure had stabilized above 100 systolic and his rhythm had held steady through 3 full minutes of observation did Katie slowly straighten. She released her hands from his sternum. Climbed down from the stretcher. Swayed once and caught herself on the bed rail. That's when she felt the full weight of the bleeding. Her scrubs were drenched. Not spattered. Drenched. The pressure dressing on her shoulder had soaked through completely, and blood was running down her ribs in hot, steady streams. The room tilted slightly at the edges. Adrenaline was leaving her system like air from a punctured tire. "Get her to trauma," someone said, but Katie held up her right hand. "Stop." "Not yet." "Stable sinus rhythm," she said to no one in particular. Her voice sounded strange, distant, like it was coming from someone else's throat. "Core temps climbing. Pupils are responsive. He'll make it." Dr. Mercer found his voice then. His face had gone the color of old concrete, and when he spoke, his words came out clipped, aggressive, almost panicked. That was completely inappropriate. A nurse performing advanced life support while actively bleeding, that's exceeding scope of practice. That's dangerous. That's how we do it in the field, Katie said quietly. She turned to face him, and something in her eyes must have stopped him mid-sentence because his jaw closed like a trap. When there's no one else. When the patient matters more than the protocol. When you decide that someone's life is worth more than your liability insurance. She didn't wait for his response. She walked to the sink, turned on the water with her right hand, watched her own blood swirl down the drain in pink spirals. The antiseptic smell of the hospital mixed with copper. It smelled like Bagram. It smelled like the small clinic where she'd trained 12 Navy corpsmen on how to keep soldiers alive when they were 3 hours from the nearest helicopter. Within the hour, Dr. Mercer was on the phone. Katie heard the fragments from the hallway as she sat in the ER getting her shoulder sutured, 17 stitches, deep enough to need a plastic surgeon's repair, though no one was willing to call that in while Mercer was prowling the hospital like a man possessed. His voice carried through the thin walls. Board members need to know immediately. Dangerous precedent. Unqualified personnel making medical decisions under duress. Liability exposure is catastrophic. We need an outside investigator. She heard him dictate an email to someone in administration, someone named Sterling, someone on the hospital's board of directors, someone who probably answered his phone before it finished ringing. Dr. Mercer's voice was smooth now, controlled, the voice of a man who understood how to weaponize institutional power. I'm requesting an immediate review of this employee's credentials, certification status, and scope of practice. I'm also requesting access to her complete personnel file and all prior incident reports. This needs to happen today. The young nurse who was finishing Katie's sutures looked up with an expression that mixed horror and admiration. He's really going after you. Yes, Katie said simply. She didn't flinch as the needle went through her skin for the final stitch. He is. By 4 p.m., HR called her into an office on the second floor. The woman behind the desk had the practiced sympathy of someone who delivered bad news 1,000 times and wanted you to know it wasn't personal. Katie, I need to place you on immediate suspension pending investigation. Dr. Mercer has filed a formal complaint regarding scope of practice violations and patient endangerment. An external investigator from the state board will be contacting you within 48 hours. You're not to return to the hospital until the investigation is complete. Katie picked up her badge from the desk. They'd already retrieved it, and held it in her palm. 7 years of perfect attendance. 7 years of saving lives in 12-hour shifts. 7 years of being invisible. I understand, she said. Your last paycheck will be mailed to your address on file. Your health insurance will continue through the end of the month. If you have any questions. I don't, Katie said. She stood. Walked out. Didn't look back. The parking lot was empty in the way that only hospital parking lots could be empty, full of cars but somehow devoid of human presence, everyone either dying or being saved inside, no one caught in the liminal space between. She sat in her truck for 20 minutes without starting the engine, her left arm in a sling now, her scrubs replaced with a clean shirt someone had found in her locker. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Your presence is requested at a secure location. Reply with confirmation or lose all contact options. She didn't recognize the number. She recognized the phrasing. Military protocol. Specific wording designed for secure channels. An official who knew exactly what they were doing, knew exactly which buttons to press. Katie turned off her phone. Started the truck. Drove home through rain that had started without her noticing, the kind of rain that fell with the weight of endings. And that's when the real nightmare began. 5 hours after the stabbing, Katie Morrison's left arm hung in a sling against her ribs, the shoulder wound sutured and bandaged beneath layers of gauze that pulled tight when she breathed. The pain medication had worn off somewhere around the parking garage. She didn't request a refill. Seattle General's basement hallway stretched empty at 2,300 hours, night shift skeleton crew 2 floors above, fluorescent lights casting everything in that particular shade of institutional gray that made time feel meaningless. Her boots, combat boots, the kind she'd worn through 3 tours, echoed on linoleum that smelled like bleach and something else, something like the end of things. She'd walked these corridors for 7 years, healing broken people in the dark, and now she was walking them to collect what remained of her life. The staff locker room was a cavern of metal doors and silence. Her locker stood open, right where she'd left it before heading into Trauma Bay 1. On the top shelf, the folded flag sat exactly as she'd placed it 2 years ago. Triangular. Precise. The kind of fold that took practice, the kind that required understanding what flags meant, not cloth and thread, but the weight of a person. The weight of Danny Chen, third-generation Marine, 23 years old, killed in Helmand Province when an IED detonated under his Humvee. Captain Morrison had sent that flag home in an envelope marked fragile. Danny's mother had never responded. Some things didn't deserve responses. Katie touched the flag with her right hand, fingers steady. She didn't allow herself more than that, one touch, one breath, then releasing. She had work to do. A hospital administrator had already called her exit interview into the system. Dr. Mercer had been efficient. He'd activated his network within 60 minutes of her removing the sharpened screwdriver from Captain Morrison's chest, 3 separate phone calls to board members, emails to administrators she'd never met, each one carefully constructed to frame a narrative of scope of practice violation, reckless endangerment, potentially fraudulent credentials. He didn't understand what she was. He only understood that she'd stepped outside her lane, and that was enough. The plastic evidence bag sat on the lower shelf, her blood-stained scrubs folded inside it, already photographed and documented. Hospital policy. Everything gets catalogued when it becomes evidence. She removed them carefully, the fabric heavy and damp in places, rust-colored stains that had started to dry at the edges but remained tacky near the center where arterial spray had soaked the cotton blend. Her blood. The attacker's blood. Morrison's stress sweat, because fear produces specific chemical signatures that no amount of cleaning could remove. Katie carried the scrubs downstairs to the laundry room, basement level, industrial space where machines hummed through their night cycles. The fluorescent lights here flickered in a pattern that almost sounded like Morse code if you listened long enough. She didn't listen long enough. She'd stopped decoding things 3 segments ago. The folding table was stainless steel, cold against her right wrist as she smoothed the fabric with her one functional arm. The precision came naturally, shoulders back, fold the sleeves first, then the torso, the kind of military corners that civilians never learned to make. 7 years as a civilian nurse, and her hand still remembered Annapolis. They still remembered the academy barracks, still remembered standing at attention, still remembered what it felt like when your name meant something other than just a nurse. The bloodstain in the center of the front panel caught light. It looked almost like a target. Appropriate, given that targets were what she'd been for the last 5 hours, ever since Mercer began his campaign. He'd called his brother-in-law on the hospital board. He'd reached out to 3 cardiologists who owed him favors from the residency matching process. He'd filed preliminary reports with the state nursing board before Katie had even finished her first blood transfusion. By the time she'd been processed through the ER for her own wound, he'd already begun constructing the narrative that would delete her from professional existence. What he didn't understand was that deletion was familiar territory. Katie folded her scrubs with the finality of someone placing flowers on a grave. The fabric was still damp in the center, blood not fully dry, not yet turned to rust, still holding a faint copper smell if you got close enough. The final indignity before termination becomes official. She set the folded scrubs in the biohazard bin, watched them settle among gauze pads and 4 lines and all the other detritus of trauma medicine. The lid closed with a soft hiss, like air escaping. Upstairs, in his corner office with the view of the parking lot, Dr. Mercer was drafting the formal complaint that would ensure she never worked as a nurse again. He had his phone pressed to his ear, voice calm and professional, the voice that worked in boardrooms and country clubs. Dangerously unstable, he was telling the chief of medicine at Mount Sinai. Her credentials don't fully check out. I have documentation. She exceeded her scope, endangered a patient, and her background investigation revealed gaps. Significant gaps. I'm concerned about who we've been employing. He didn't know that her background investigation had been conducted by the Department of Defense. He didn't know that certain flags had been raised in classified databases the moment his queries touched her file. He didn't know that somewhere in a Pentagon building, analysts who'd read every after-action report, every mission briefing, every debrief about Operation Archangel were already putting together a response. He'd activated something far larger than his institutional authority. He'd activated protocols designed to protect national security assets. He'd painted a target on his own career and didn't even know the weapon was already chambered. Katie climbed the stairs back to ground level, the sling pulling at her shoulder with each step, pain radiating down her arm like electricity through wet wire. She could have requested another dose of fentanyl before they escorted her from the building. She could have accepted their sympathy, their murmured apologies, their promises that they'd look into the allegations. She could have played the victim. Instead, she walked to the security desk where they were processing her termination documents, and she surrendered her badge without comment. The photo on it was 3 years old, long blonde hair, tired eyes, the face of someone who'd successfully convinced the world she was ordinary. She'd spent 7 years perfecting that performance. Mercer had spent 5 hours destroying it. A security officer handed her a folder containing her final paycheck, her separation documentation, her non-compete agreement. The agreement was standard: she couldn't work in nursing within 50 miles of Seattle General for 2 years. As if she'd still be in Seattle in 2 years. As if she'd still be working in nursing. Dr. Mercer watched from 30 feet away, leaning against the hallway wall near the trauma bays, arms crossed, expression satisfied. He'd won. He'd identified a nurse who operated outside her credentials, outside her training, outside the hierarchy that kept hospitals functioning, and he'd used the system to remove her. He would get commendations for identifying the problem. He would serve on another committee. His career arc was still climbing. He had no idea that the real nightmare was about to begin. The ambulance arrived at 0300 hours with lights off, escorted by federal marshals in windbreakers, flanked by a Marine Corps liaison officer who moved like someone trained to break things quietly. Katie was in the staff break room pretending to read a magazine for her exit interview, her shoulder throbbing in rhythm with her heartbeat, when she heard the commotion in Trauma 1. Old instinct pulled her to the doorway. She didn't go inside. Suspended staff weren't permitted in active bays, but she could see the gurney being rolled in, could hear the patient's voice escalating in Pashto, could hear the controlled urgency in the medical team's responses. Then the patient's eyes found hers across the bay. His face went white. Not pale. Not simply frightened. The specific shade of white that comes from seeing someone you thought was dead, someone you thought was a legend, someone who had existed only in stories told at night by men who'd survived impossible things. He stopped mid-struggle, his entire body going rigid. Valkyrie. His voice was reverent, terrified, like calling out to a ghost. Valkyrie. Valkyrie. The room went dead silent. The Marine Corps liaison officer went rigid beside the gurney. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for his phone, pulled up something on the screen, then turned to face Dr. Mercer with an expression like a man standing on a trapdoor while someone unscrewed the hinges. "Captain Katie Morrison," the officer said quietly. "United States Navy." Dr. Mercer's face shifted. Confusion. Irritation. "She's suspended." "She's not." Navy Cross for extraordinary heroism in combat operations. The Marine's voice was steady now, official, the kind of voice that closed conversations and opened investigations. "Silver Star. 3 Purple Hearts." "That's impossible," Mercer said. "She's just a boots on tile. 3 sets. Military bearing, the kind of posture that made the air pressure change." A 2-star general entered Trauma 1, flanked by 2 officers in dress uniform, insignia gleaming under the harsh bay lights. The general didn't acknowledge Mercer. He was looking at Katie, and his expression was the specific mixture of respect and recognition that comes from understanding exactly what she was. He rendered a salute, fist to chest, held for 3 full seconds. Katie, still in her emergency department scrubs, still wearing her sling, still bleeding through fresh gauze on her left shoulder, returned it with her right hand. "Captain Morrison," the general said. "Operation Archangel. 14 confirmed field thoracotomies with a combat knife. The surgical interventions we'll be studying at the Naval Academy for the next 20 years. He turned to face Mercer directly. "Stand at attention when you address her, Doctor." The ambulance doors burst open at 3 in the morning, and the stretcher rolled through the trauma bay flanked by federal marshals in dark suits, their hands resting on holstered weapons. The man on the stretcher thrashed against soft restraints, his eyes wild, blooded bandages wrapped around both wrists where he'd tried to cut his own throat in federal custody. The Marine Corps liaison officer trailing the stretcher carried a file folder sealed with red classified tape, his jaw clenched tight as the paramedics transferred the patient to the bay. Katie was already moving toward the vital signs monitor, her left arm still bound, her right hand steady on the equipment when the man's eyes found hers across the sterile field. His entire body went rigid. He stopped thrashing. His voice emerged like something torn from underground, ragged and urgent. "Valkyrie! Valkyrie!" The stretcher stopped. 3 marshals moved closer. The liaison officer stepped forward, his boots hitting the tile floor with the deliberate weight of someone trained to command a room, and Katie felt every muscle in her body turn to stone because only 40 people in the world knew that call sign, and those 40 people were supposed to be dead or deployed on the other side of the planet. The liaison officer opened the classified file. His hands didn't shake. Captain Katie Morrison, Navy Cross for extraordinary heroism. He paused, waiting for reaction. The room held its breath. Silver Star. Another pause, longer this time. A nurse in the corner stopped moving. 3 Purple Hearts. The liaison let those words sit in the fluorescent silence like stones dropped into still water, each one creating a ripple nobody could ignore. Declared KIA to protect an operation that saved 214 lives. Bagram, December 14, 2019. The extraction went sideways. You held the perimeter for 4 hours alone while a medevac was inbound. You were supposed to be a name in a database, not a woman standing here with a stab wound in her shoulder. The doors to the trauma bay opened again, and the air pressure changed. A 2-star general in dress blues walked through like he owned the floor beneath his feet, his aide trailing behind with a leather portfolio. His eyes found Dr. Mercer frozen against the far wall, and something shifted in the general's expression, a thin smile, the kind an apex predator makes when it recognizes prey. "Stand at attention when you address her, Doctor." It wasn't a request. It wasn't a command. It was the voice of a man who'd sent soldiers into the sand and brought home their flags in wooden boxes, and Dr. Mercer's body obeyed before his mind could catch up, his spine straightening, his hands dropping to his sides. The general moved toward Katie like he was crossing a battlefield he'd memorized, and he rendered a salute so sharp it snapped, his hand held at a perfect angle against his temple. Katie's breath caught somewhere behind her ribs. She returned the salute with her right hand, her wounded left arm held careful against her body, and something in her voice changed when she spoke, dropped an octave, steadied itself into the cadence of someone who'd given orders in darkness. "General." "Sir." The liaison officer continued reading from the classified file, his voice carrying the weight of documents that had been buried under national security protocols and need-to-know restrictions. Captain Morrison's Navy record was erased and sealed. A new civilian identity was provided. She was to disappear into civilian life and never resurface under any circumstances. The operation that required her disappearance involved foreign intelligence assets, diplomatic complications, and a classified extraction that is still active in restricted databases. He turned a page. Papers rustled. Your inquiry into Captain Morrison's medical credentials, Dr. Mercer, triggered an automatic flag in the Pentagon's personnel security system. Your investigation initiated a counter-investigation. The general's aide opened the leather portfolio and withdrew a second file, this one thick as a textbook, and placed it on the nearest equipment tray with the deliberate slowness of someone placing evidence at a crime scene. This file contains 5 years of patient records from Seattle General, extracted and reviewed by the Pentagon security team. 5 years of malpractice buried in those files. Surgical errors you attributed to nursing staff. Medication complications you blamed on pharmacy. Patient infections that occurred in your operating theater, documented in your own notes, then revised in subsequent notes when complications emerged. The general's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. You falsified records. You fabricated evidence. You attempted to destroy the credibility of a federal asset to cover your own incompetence. That rises to criminal interference with federal operations. Dr. Mercer's face had gone the color of old porcelain, his mouth opening and closing like something mechanical. I didn't know, I was just conducting a standard. You were conducting a vendetta against a woman you perceived as beneath you, using the hospital's administrative apparatus as your weapon. The liaison officer closed the file with a sound like a door slamming. The Pentagon recommends permanent license revocation, criminal charges, and debarment from all federal contracting. The medical board received this documentation at 0600 hours this morning. Your hospital privileges are suspended effective immediately. Your keycard access has been deactivated. Your office has been secured. 6 months later, someone from the nursing staff at Seattle General spotted him at a community center teaching CPR basics to a class of 8 people, his hands moving through the chest compression slowly, mechanically, like a video playing on half speed. His medical license had been permanently revoked. The hospital had settled Katie's wrongful termination case for an amount nobody would disclose, and the board had issued a public apology that ran 2 inches in the Seattle Times. But Dr. Mercer was teaching minimum wage, his tailored suits replaced with khakis and a polo shirt that didn't quite fit anymore, his credibility scattered across judicial filings and medical board investigations like ash from something that had burned to nothing. The trembling wasn't fear. It was the tremor of a man who'd spent his entire life building a fortress of credentials and titles and institutional power, only to watch it collapse in 6 hours because he'd tried to destroy someone who'd been trained to survive things he couldn't even imagine. Katie stood in the private hospital room on the 8th floor while a Navy medical officer worked with meticulous precision on her shoulder wound, cleaning away the emergency room work that had been rushed, had been done without the knowledge of who she was or what her tissue meant. The stitches went in with the same careful spacing a surgeon uses on a joint that will need to perform under extreme duress, her shoulder treated like the tactical asset it was. Captain Derek Morrison sat in the chair beside her bed, no longer in a hospital gown but in dress uniform, his uniform perfectly pressed, his rows of ribbons catching the light. His presence in the room was the size of an aircraft carrier. "The general wants you to have options," he said quietly, watching the medical officer work. "Reinstatement of rank. Back pay for 5 years. Choice between active duty or honorable discharge with full benefits." Katie's left hand found the folded flag in her jacket pocket, the fabric soft from 18 years of handling, from touching it on the nights when she couldn't sleep, when she could see her son's face the way it had been before Bagram, before the call came at midnight saying his team had been hit by an IED and only 3 of 6 had walked out. The fabric had traveled with her from her Navy bunk to her nurse's locker, from her husband's funeral to her son's flag ceremony, from active duty to civilian life to this moment in a hospital room, where her past had finally caught up with her present. Captain Morrison stood. His movements had the precision of someone trained to execute actions the same way every time, and he rendered a salute so sharp it rang through the room, his hand at a perfect angle, his body still as a monument. Katie returned the salute with her right hand, her wounded shoulder steady despite the pain radiating down her arm, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of decisions made in darkness, of orders given that meant people lived or died, of competence that had never needed a credential to prove itself. "Your son would be proud," Morrison said, and his voice cracked on the words. "He always said you were the toughest person he knew." Seattle General offered her chief of trauma nursing, triple her old salary, a formal apology in writing from the hospital board and a commitment to restructure how nurses were treated in grand rounds. She accepted on one condition, a memorial plaque in the trauma bay for the fallen teammate whose flag she'd carried, and for her son who had served under Captain Morrison, whose name was going to exist in that hospital forever, whose memory was going to save future decisions the way it had saved hers. The unveiling ceremony happened on a Thursday in October, and Katie stood in her Navy dress uniform with the Navy Cross on her chest, the medal catching the light like a prayer answered. A young nurse approached her after the ceremony, her badge showing an associate's degree from a state school, her resume carrying the weight of someone who'd fought for every credential she had. "How do you handle doctors who look down on you?" she asked, nervous, like she was asking something dangerous. Katie thought of the vending machine. She thought of Dr. Mercer asking residents to identify her critical errors while she stood 3 feet away. She thought of 18-year-old medics under mortar fire in Bagram, doing emergency thoracotomies with combat knives, performing life-saving procedures that would make civilian doctors weep with the impossibility of it. She thought of competence that doesn't live in titles or degrees, but in the simple, relentless ability to help. The ones who have seen the worst often give the most, she said. Remember that, and let your work speak. If you haven't subscribed yet, now's the moment. These stories get better, and you won't want to miss what comes next. Like this video, share it with someone who believes in the power of quiet strength, and tell me in the comments, what would you have done in Katie's position?